You're listening to the I Love You Keep Going podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
So welcome everybody. This is I Love You Keep Going. It is March 30th, 2023, 7:38 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And I've been fascinated by the conversation around the emergence of artificial intelligence, mainly ChatGPT. I don't know if you've played around with it at all. I tried it, and it's so wildly inaccurate in the things that it says that I have to check everything with Google to make sure that that's realistic or accurate. It's Christian.
I was talking to my brother who's more technological than I am today about that very thing, and I was trying to explain that I don't think that there's an epistemic gap with that, where you don't know the basis for where its information is coming from, and that it can't have insight or meaning, but it can have data.
Right.
And he was really insisting that I should try it for myself. So he was giving me a little Buddhist reversal or something. But he fully believed that they had meaning and insight, and maybe in a totally naive way, which I found interesting.
So I said to ChatGPT, can you give me the percentages of the population of the Earth divided by continent? And it gave me the percentages, and when I added them up, it added up to 108. That's what I mean by inaccuracies. 108 is not a bad number in Buddhist circles, of course, but not what you would expect. So I think of it as a more conversational version of what's already there in the world in terms of search. You know, you ask it to write a poem and it writes a poem. I love poetry and I spend a lot of time reading poetry, and the poems that it generates are generic and uninteresting to me because they don't really have a point of view. They're not really. It isn't a voice. It's so generic and indeterminate that to me it's uninteresting as a poem. I've seen some of the visual art that it creates, and it has that razzle dazzle sort of feel to it. But ultimately, it's also not interesting as a expression of the human experience. Now, obviously, artificial intelligence is not a word that is actually what we're talking about. We're just talking about big data sets being crunched, which is a whole different thing, I think. But I did have somebody send me an article about the immediate moratorium that we have to have on all of these large language models, because if we don't, all life on the planet will be eliminated, which I also thought was quite interesting. And really what we're talking about here is view. I have the experience of that admonishment like Y2K. Do you remember Y2K? I actually couldn't understand how Y2K could be taken seriously as an idea. It seemed impossible that the whole world would collapse. And so that's how my mind is orienting this conversation. Although I can see that the military is probably making automatic sort of machines that are useful in the service of war. They have such a problem with the drone pilots having PTSD and other negative consequences of flying those missions. I imagine the police would also like to have those. Although that again is talking about this idea of view. There was an article in the paper about uh, tightness and looseness in view, and tightness being associated with these ideas of rigid control of ideas, rigid control of morality, rigid control of what you really can believe or not believe. And that that's associated with the kind of restrictions in how you can actually be, how you can represent yourself. And then looseness is more where there's a range of expressions, a range of ideas that you can express without friction from the people around you. So maybe we could talk about a tight view versus a loose view. The geographic association was the southern states had very tight views, and the west coast and the northeast had very loose views, and the middle of the country was in between. We make the conceptual reality that we have around our conditioning. So we have the capacity to sense something. We have an object that can be sensed by that sense gate. So light by the retina picking up photons, the ear sensitive to a narrow frequency of sound, vibrations, the body sensitive to a narrow range of temperature. We can smell some things, we can taste some things. But that pure sensing data doesn't actually line up for anything. It doesn't mean anything in and of itself. There's nothing intrinsic about any of it. And what I mean by that is three people could have the same experience of the same thing happening, and it's very likely, almost a necessity of the nature of the human condition, that three realities emerge from that. We have the capacity to sense the object that can be sensed when it makes contact with that capacity. We create a sensing experience, which is unattached in the Buddhist sense, not fixated, not solid, without meaning. It's evaluated for processing speed. Does it need urgent attention? Does it not matter? If there's time for a pleasant experience, do we have that time? And then it's compared to the perceptual database, which is filled with all of the previously experienced events that have been recorded, and also the imagination, so that if there's a unique event that hasn't been already interpreted, we have the capacity to understand what that is. And then if either there's a previous entry or the imagination takes hold and creates a meaning for this undifferentiated, unfixated ultimate reality, it rolls into conceptual reality. And if those views are tight, then we have a sense of that meaningfulness being more universal than if it's loose. We have a sense that actually it applies to us because we're the ones who've made it up. It may or may not have a usefulness for other people. When I contemplate the existential threat of artificial intelligence taking over the world and killing all life, it's very hard for me to make sense of that. It really resonates not at all. Which is not to say that it is or is not something that could happen. But then the conflict in Ukraine and the threat of nuclear war, which appears now and then in the paper, actually is quite frightening to me. Now, I grew up in the 50s where we rehearsed nuclear attacks by hiding under our desks. If you're not aware of how the nuclear age was welcomed in elementary schools across our country, they would ring do we even have those anymore? We used to have the siren that would ring, which meant that you had to run for your fallout shelters is what we call them. And in the town I grew up in, they tested it every Thursday at 10 a.m. So the air raid siren would go off. It was quite loud, I remember. Everybody just assuming that it was 10 a.m., not frightened by it, but everybody knew what it was. I'm talking about school-age children. Christian?
I think the fear for millennials, I don't know if it's still around for us, but it was always the Bermuda Triangle.
Yes, that was my ultimate idea for suicide. Steal a boat and sail around the Bermuda Triangle until you vanish. My mother was very skeptical about the value of school children hiding under desks in a nuclear attack. So I don't think it was even about practicality or anything that was useful. It was simply to relieve the anxiety of was it the children or the parents? The third of great existential threat of our time, of course, is climate change. I have the visceral sense that the opportunity actually to mitigate climate change has come and gone, and that we didn't do anything about it. So now we're just going to have climate change. And what that is really going to lead to is these massive migrations of people out of the places that are no longer going to be habitable, which would be the equator zone. So about 20% of the population of the world is going to have to move into different climate zones, and then how willing we are to allow that to happen without a lot of friction. It looks to me now like we're not that willing to let it happen, because there is a lot of friction around climate refugees being able to move freely. They're not going to be able to stay where they are, so it seems like an impractical view to think that we don't have to accommodate this in some way. You know, I thought the idea of the wall across the southern border was comical, in the sense you build a 30-foot wall across the southern portion of the country, and then somebody comes along with the 31-foot ladder and they just climb over it. So how do we get into these views? How do we construct these experiences of reality? There's a dialogue, a culture-wide dialogue, a society-wide dialogue. So society is this collection of all of the different cultures that we have. And then each of the cultures forms around specific ideas and beliefs. Do we have a container that allows all of those expressions of all of those cultures? Or do we feel the need to confine the structures of society that don't allow the expressions of some of those cultures? If I think back on the idea of nuclear threat, there's just hundreds and hundreds of experiences of that being presented and the responses that we took, that worry. We built this fantastic array of nuclear missiles across the country. I remember that the technology got to the point where there was a movement to replace it with more modern technology, and it was like the cost of which was some huge amount, like $19 trillion to upgrade our nuclear arsenal, which was not feasible. It's just too much money for that. What are the views in a society where so much of our resources goes toward this defensive posture? One of the things I notice about the conversation around AI being this terrible, uncontrollable technology which is going to wipe out all of life on the planet. It has this fearful quality, this almost paranoid quality, but it isn't so dissimilar to the mentality or the dialogue that went into convincing us as a society, a culture, to build this vast array of weapons. The weapons themselves, of course, capable of eliminating life. Did you read in the paper that Jack Ma has returned to China, the founder of Alibaba, that the Chinese government has opened up to him again? He famously said that China has all of this infrastructure and all of this technological advance because they spent $6 trillion on infrastructure, and the US spent $6 trillion on the war in the Middle East, which is a different value. In this culture that I live in, which is part of society, there is a strong resistance to the idea that we should be doing this, and at the same time, a powerlessness to do anything different about it. And so often the drive there is to move into a kind of unconsciousness about it and withdraw from engagement around it. I think that was particularly strong in the previous administration. There was a sense of confusion about how the ideas that were being expressed there were really resonating, at least in the circle that I tend to travel in. It seemed so obvious from that cultural view of another cultural view, and that unconsciousness, that desire simply to remove from it because it creates such turmoil, such distress, is very strong. How then do you come into a place of equanimity where you really can be engaged with this experience as it's unfolding, this understanding this cultural bias, this way in which you create the view of what's actually happening, and at the same time open to the experience of other cultural views? Christian?
George, you've described like very much in terms of emotions that we get our labels, or we get how we experience emotions, transmitted to us from our parents or caregivers, largely attachment figures, I guess. And I'm really curious how you think that these societal views get inside of us, because I would think that there'd be some, the way that our attachment is might affect our ability to trust or not to trust kind of the outside world and take information from it. And so like I think of disorganized people as being more susceptible to conspiracy theory views. I think of avoidant people as being maybe more susceptible to kind of libertarian views, to put it in a really generic way. So do you think the parents are the sort of ultimate conduits for the views, or there's like mentalizing factors involved, or how do you think that the societal actually filters down to the individual?
I probably think of it more as a mentalizing capacity. And high mentalizing is more associated with security than it is with insecurity or disorganization. Um, but I think that my experience of people who get caught up in ideas that seem irrational to me and not well thought about are not using the mentalizing of spontaneous versus monitoring very well, and nor the one of affective versus cognitive. Just to use two and make it a little simpler, they're very swept up in spontaneity, spontaneous responses. They don't monitor much. They don't track whether an idea remains true over a period of time or is proven untrue over time, because they don't monitor it. They're not cognitive. They don't think through things. They don't have the mentalizing capacity to do that. They're very emotional. So if it feels like it matches their emotional experience, then it becomes real in the way that all conceptual reality is real. It's not different. Their perception of conceptual reality is not different fundamentally than your conception of your conceptual reality. Does it match ultimate reality is really the question. If you're constantly in this proposition of touching into the conceptual reality that you make from ultimate reality back into ultimate reality to see whether or not the conceptual reality that you've made matches ultimate reality, and you're constantly in a process of evaluating the accuracy of your perceptions of things and the accuracy of what you make out of those perceptions, then, and you have reliable sources of input, then maybe you can make a better map of what's actually happening. If you can mentalize better, you can of course take in more experience, and more of that will be reflected in your conceptualization of things. And if you can't do that, then it will be less accurate, really. So then how does that map out on different attachment strategies? Dismissing people, or people who have a dismissing quality to their attachment strategies, rely on internal working models that they've created themselves. They don't validate them much. So that would be a place that could get quite distorted. Fearfully preoccupied people are in such an internal state of chaos, they can't really make sense of what's happening too much. Fearful, avoidant people tend to get quite paranoid and to assign sinister motives to other people. They also don't do a lot of checking. It's that constant. I think of it almost as a rocking motion. This is what I'm sensing. This is what I've made. This is what I'm sensing. This is what I've made. How well does what I've made match the sensing, and this constant back and forth and investigating? I grew up in a Republican family. My mother used to say that she was significantly to the right of Attila the Hun, jokingly. They sent me to Interlaken, which is a music camp. And when I came back and I was talking about the different conversations that I had, she said that she thought it was the worst mistake they could have made, because I was exposed to ideas outside of the Republican bubble. But I didn't find the Republican bubble ideas that compelling. I didn't see the happiness in the pursuit of social status and material things. But I grew up in some sense in an immigrant family, Irish. shanty Irish, not lace curtain Irish. They came poor, mid 19th century, and there was a strong ethos of moving up the economic ladder. A lot of focus on education in the generations before, and then we, in some sense, arrived where all of that generational effort was supposed to land and produce this ideal life, but it wasn't. It was clearly not that from my perspective. So the way that it landed on me was that was not a pursuit that was going to lead to a sense of liveliness. So it wasn't being sent to camp that changed my view. It was that period of adolescence where the mind expands and your cognitive ability expands, and you can take in ideas from other places than the limits of your family. And in that contrast, seeing the limitations of where I was, and wanting, rejecting that and wanting something different. But then we each grow up in our family systems, and we learn really well the system that we grow up in. And sometimes we have the capacity for insight into the nature of how that system is operating and the effects that it's having on people. And if we don't simply deny it or suppress it, particularly in that adolescent period where the mind really expands in its capacity to think and to understand, if we allow that to happen, we often can see it more clearly, and maybe want something different. And then are we able to then, and we're then, when I say move towards something, I'm talking about exploration, the exploration piece here. We're able to move into primary exploration where we're actually looking to satisfy the meaning qualities of life, to pursue meaningfulness, or do we get sidetracked? I grew up in a family that was very oriented toward secondary exploration, big house, big cars, a lot of nice things. But the meaningful aspect was completely unattended to. Christian?
But I take it that there was a certain either freedom for you intellectually or at least lack of restriction. Like during that time, I've met people that maybe came from a very restricted worldview. Like you said, you mentioned different geographic regions that might have that. And I would think that during that time, if a family was really restrictive on what they allowed in, for their child, or that they explained things in very black and white ways to the child, that might restrict the child's taking in those other views, taking in opposing views. But that wasn't the case in your family?
No, it was very restricted. I just learned to keep secrets. I learned to lie. Those were the strategies that I had. I learned to pretend. Which, ultimately was not such a horrible thing, because I did manage to pursue the things that I wanted to pursue. I just had to keep them secret. The consequences of making a mistake were usually pretty bad. And then I think I became completely unruly, and so they really just stopped interfering with me. That was what ended up happening. It was already neglectful. They just disengaged altogether. I think my mother disengaged because she found it so hurtful and so rejecting that I didn't embrace the ideas that she was offering, but my dad was simply indifferent. This is a conversation about view, and so when you don't have that environment where you can freely express yourself, and you do end up having to keep secrets, you do have to end up internalizing it. Of course, it distorts the experience of that. Really, what's important, I think, about this is that you begin in your practice of meditation to pull these things apart so that you can actually see what happened, right? This is one of the skill set of secure functioning, to understand the consequences of it. I have this in a brochure. We put out a brochure of the characteristics of secure attachment. Seeing clearly what happened without minimizing the negative effects is an important aspect of this. Part of that is the development of positivity, intentional positivity, and associate it with the self-experience. When the self-experience arises, we have this framework, this working model that has all of these memory and experiential gists, these little algorithms of creating experience associated with it. And when the sense of self arises, it's arising because these gists are activating patterns of experience in the body that we then recognize as the experience of self, right? Is that making sense? Then when you grow up in an environment like I described, that array of activations is very negative. The experience of the self is very negative. The reflection from a family system where your ideas are not embraced and you have to keep them secret because the consequences of retaliation for expressing them creates a working model of self that has that trepidation and that fearfulness that if you reveal yourself, you're in danger. And so every time the self is activated, you have a sense of being in danger in the world. That's the realm of disorganized people. How you know yourself is because you're in danger. That's one of the aspects of attachment functioning, how that works. You're not really in danger after you've left the dangerous environment, but because the way that you know yourself is this perception that you're always in danger, each time the sense of self arises, you have the experience of, or you have the creation of conceptual reality that makes the world dangerous. This is, again, the thing that we need to really begin to investigate when we're exploring the view related to attachment conditioning. But when we create these views and we make them accurate and real, and we then push out into the world with our intention and action that our perception of these things is accurate, and expect the group that we're in to respond in the way that we experience it, then we have this push that moves out beyond the sense of self into the small group. But then as it affects the small groups and the small groups push against the larger group, we create a culture-wide or society-wide experience. I'm just touching into the idea of AI being the significant existential threat to the survival of the planet that it's often talked about as, and it doesn't resonate at all for me. I think we're far away from actual artificial intelligence, but there was a caveat in the article I read that it doesn't have to be conscious. It doesn't have to be a unique identity. Just the mechanical nature of the way that these large language models would be enough. Christian?
I think I have a fear to what you were saying earlier, that it's gonna just flood the world with really boring and crappy art. Isn't that a sort of existential death if like it's just crappy art and you can't even get to the good stuff?
um, it's very funny because when the word processor came out, the great comic fear was the deluge of crap poetry, as if the handwritten stuff weren't already a tidal wave. Now there's just no limit. ChatGPT, please write 500 haikus. One after the other. There was an article in the paper about a rather well-known author who they discovered like 75 plagiarized passages in the book that they just published, which meant that they had been using these generative systems to write the books, and then hadn't bothered to run them through the software that would then evaluate whether or not all of the plagiarized material was either cited or rewritten enough that it was no longer plagiarized. And the fear of college professors that all of the papers that were going to be generated in class were going to be these large language model generations in high school. And it does create that self-fulfilling problem of people not really learning to think and just substituting non-thinking for how they begin to perceive the world, so that they don't have a way of understanding their perception or view of things, because they don't have a way of mentalizing it really. The public education system was supposed to save us from the mob, as my mother would say. And we've systematically stripped that system so that it doesn't function very well. And now we have the mob. So did we not know that? We did know that. Why did we do it anyway? Because there's an advantage in it for some groups. That's how I think about it. So here we are at this point in the world, the way that the world is, with these different things happening. How do we remain engaged in this process of community, where the tightness side of things wants to restrict all of this, and the looseness side of things thinks that all of these things should be in play? Where do you land in this? And not want to just withdraw and shut down and not pay attention to it anymore because it's too intractable, it's too painful. So that is really the intersection, I think, that is useful in practice, that we can really open into this experience of every moment unfolding and receive it all, and not have to tune it all out and fall into a kind of ignorance in the Buddhist sense of the word, not paying attention, distraction. We are a culture that loves distraction above all things. I wish that it wasn't so violent and that it didn't kill so many women. But that is the form of entertainment that we've embraced, to distract us from the intensity of these experiences. So, is that all making sense in terms of a conversation about view? So then in terms of practice, I think one of the things to do is to begin to notice the way that the mind reacts to that. And I like to do that by, I call it investigating self-generated emotion, where you're actually tracking your thought processes in reaction to the present moment. I talk about it in terms of the one-off thoughts that are related to the arising and passing of the present moment. Experience just that activation of the self-experience in relationship to the present moment. Maybe the mind is still or quiet, and then the mind caught up in repetitive thought. That's where the experience of the present moment overwhelms, and we withdraw into the thinking to escape from it. One of the things that is important to be able to do as you're out and about in the world and tracking things is to notice when you're actually engaged in the experience of the present moment and when you've withdrawn into a thinking process or a fantasy process or a planning process or a sentimentalizing memory process, and pushing into the present moment each time, coming out of that back into the present moment. So why don't we do a little practice and focus on that particular way of looking at things? Maybe the existential threat of AI is actually what that tight view is. And then I wonder what that conditioning would be that I would have to engage in order to actually experience that, because it seems so foreign. We'll do a little bit of concentration to settle the mind, and then do a period of investigating self-generated emotion. Ringing the bell. Any comments or questions about the practice that we did? So let's see. We have a level 2 starting in April if you're interested in that. We have a meditation and addiction coming up, which is 3 Saturdays around that material. We haven't done it in a while, so I think it's going to be good. I'm co-teaching that with Stas Fedichin. What else? Anyway, there's a bunch of stuff on the website. Take a look at it. We're going to do our first level 2 class during the day rather than in the afternoon, which is better for European time if that makes sense. I think that starts in July. I'm doing a in-person level 1 in Utrecht in the first week or so of June. We've set some dates to do a I Love You Keep Going weekend retreat in Oakland in July. I think it's in July. So that might be something to consider. The I Love You Keep Going day-longs are about exploring collaborative relationship systems. So it's the attachment lens on collaborative relationships. I think that's about it for now. We've actually finished booking the whole year, but I'm having a hard time remembering the second half of the year. So let's leave that out there in the future. I offer the teaching in this format freely, but I do hope that you'll make a donation if you have resources. It helps support me, and also the work that Mettagroup does. Any amount is appreciated, certainly, but please come and practice. I hope to see you soon on the path. Appreciate you. Bye.